You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your gender-affirming host, Abraham.
And I am your sexually educated host, Shane.
Beautiful. Well, then you must not be from Florida.
Nope. Actually, what's weird is I am. I just done it like as Matthew McConaughey says in his book, it's like outlaw logic, where it's like you kind of go against the grain and you do the things you need to.
Nice. I like that.
Didn't think I was going to quote Matthew McConaughey in this one, but here we are.
I was going to say, kicking off the episode with a quote from Matthew McConaughey is off to a good start, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a real odd place we're in these days.
Hey, we are a psychology podcast, and one of the psychology things that we do is talk about sex and gender. Mm-hmm. Or do sex and gender, I guess. So there's things to talk about inside of that. And actually, this is a rerun. It is a nostalgia episode. We are digging this one out to dust it off, take a look at it, see what we can glean. And we're going to rerun this entire discussion. And then we'll also, once we get through the original content, we'll do some updating on some other things that have happened inside of this discussion since then.
Yeah. And so going back and listening to the episode, they cover a lot. The guest on the show, Lauren, really knows her stuff. So that was really cool to hear her discussion and all that. So what we're hoping to do is get that information from the original episode. And then we'll, like Abraham said, we'll have some cool updates, some additional things, some stuff that wasn't included in the original that we hope you'll enjoy.
If you are listening to this on the day that it releases, that is, today would be September 14th, which is National Cream-Filled Donut Day.
Boston cream donuts rule.
Yeah, it is also National Eat a Hoagie Day. And although I'm not sure how we're going to navigate this in this podcast, it is National Quiet Day. So
there it is. We just honored it.
Yeah, we just honored it with that 2 seconds of silence.
Yes.
A couple of things I feel like this entire month celebrates about 100 different things. So we shouted out some last episode, but September is also Sepsis Awareness Month and Friendship Month. And it is also National Honey Month.
Oh, I like that.
Interpret that as you will. Yeah.
Yeah. I do like that there are multiple, like this day and age, there are multiple interpretations.
Yeah. And we'll just keep shouting out the rest of the month things in subsequent September releases. So be on the lookout for those, I suppose. And maybe you're already celebrating in your own private way, and that's great. Mm-hmm. I think that's all that I have. We'll talk about how you can support the show and join our little club of community people at the end of this. But without further stalling and honoring of silence, here is our nostalgic look at this episode. Hello and welcome to Why We Do What We Do. This is Abraham and my co-host
Ryan O.
And we have a special guest today. Her name is Lauren.
Hello.
We invited Lauren here today because we wanted to talk about gender issues, and we're not as much of an expert at this as Lauren is. So we asked Lauren to come in, answer some questions for us, impart some wisdom on us. And so let's actually start by just give a little bit of background on yourself, Lauren.
I currently teach psychology of gender at the University of Nevada, Reno, and have taught it quite a bit. So have got very interested in the subject and have found it to be kind of fascinating to talk about and research. And so that was mostly just kind of thrown at you, right? You didn't get your degree in gender studies or anything like that? No. My degree's in psychology.
Okay.
All right. So I don't know a whole lot about this topic. And one of the first things I ran into when I was looking around was that there's differences between sex and gender. So maybe we can start there. What do you think?
Yeah, let's do that.
So we're focusing on gender. So let's maybe start with sex. Like, what is that?
So when people talk about sex, even though a lot of times this can be misconstrued, generally you're talking about the biological makeup of an individual that makes them either male or female.
So speaking technically in the scientific sense, that's what sex refers to? That
would include the primary sex characteristics, which are absence or presence of a penis or vagina. And then there's secondary sex characteristics, so that would be breasts, facial hair, different things like that.
And so which aspect of sex refers to the chromosomes and hormones and stuff like that?
So the androgens?
Sure. Is that primary or secondary?
Primary.
Okay.
What's an androgen?
Androgen is just the blanket term to refer to either testosterone or estrogen. or any other hormones that a person might have in their body.
Okay, perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's sex.
And this is different from gender, technically speaking.
So gender is more the social constructs around ways that we classify males or females. Is completely dependent upon one's culture and social, other psychological factors.
Okay, what do you mean by psychological factors?
This is essentially how a person identifies themselves.
Okay.
That makes sense. And it may or may not, so to speak, match with their biological sex.
Okay, can you say more about that?
So in general, people will refer to a person's gender, or people whose gender matches or does not match their biological sex will either be called cisgender if your biological sex and your identified gender match.
Okay.
And transgender if they do not match. I hate using the word match just because it assumes that sex is black and white and gender itself is black and white.
Right. So there's like a correct or incorrect answer to...
Yes, okay. Essentially. And most of the time it's based on assumptions that, I can see somebody and identify that they are either male or female and they are acting either like a male or a female. So it depends, again, entirely upon cultural and social factors that each person is a part of.
Okay, so just to recap then, sex is the biological characteristics that are either male or female, and gender is the social or cultural behaviors that are referred to as either being masculine or feminine. Is that correct?
Yes, although sex isn't, although a little more clear-cut, isn't necessarily 100% clear-cut as to whether someone's 100% male, 100% female, just because there are a lot of chromosomal issues. There are issues around the androgens that a person's exposed to. So, for example, there's XXX syndrome that a female fetus may have. Klinefelter syndrome is XXY chromosomes, I believe.
Okay. And so just for people who may not know, a typical, I guess you could call it typical, if that's appropriate.
Typically developing fetus.
So if it was female, then it would just be two X chromosomes, and a male would just have one X and one Y chromosome, so an XY. Yeah. So a triple X would be, as you were saying, just, what was that one called?
Just triple X.
Oh, it's triple X, okay. Return of Xander Cage. So the triple X is where there are then 3 of the X chromosomes present, and then what was the Klinefelters?
XXY.
If they have that arrangement of chromosomes, how are they classified? Is that they fall into male or female?
So with Klinefelter syndrome, the fetus is considered a male but is born with an extra X chromosome, and so they will likely, again, have a penis, but they might have reduced muscle mass, less facial hair, less body hair as a result. And it can produce little or no sperm. Turner syndrome, XO, so that's the absence of a Y or an X chromosome, so the fetus is born looking female-like, but being very short in stature and having kind of some other developmental issues.
So there's only one sex chromosome in an XO. Is there ever a case where there's 0 sex chromosomes?
I don't think so. I think there's usually at least one.
How many variations on like sex chromosome arrangements can you have?
There's quite a few. There are kind of the typical, so XXY Klinefelters. There's 2 Y chromosomes that people talk about, triple X, Turner syndrome, and then sometimes there are mosaics, so sometimes there end up being like 4 or more.
Wow. It's a whole bunch of different sex chromosomes.
It's not super common, but it does happen, which then puts that person in the situation where are you a male or female? And technically, if you're not XY or XX, a lot of times you fall outside of those societal standards of what you should be if you're embracing both masculine and feminine characteristics.
Okay, so one of the things I was going to ask is, for these people who have these sort of variations in their chromosome development, are they able to reproduce?
It completely depends on the situation.
Okay, so let's move into, I want to discuss with you how we can understand like the behavior of individuals with respect to their sex and gender. So if someone's born biologically with a penis versus biologically with a vagina, what can we expect in terms of their behavior?
Well, really what a lot of research in gender studies has shown, and there are a lot of really good books out there if anyone's interested on gender. Cordelia Fine has a book called Delusions of Gender. It's really good. Carol Tavris wrote Mismeasure of Woman. She talks a lot about research around gendered studies. And then Anne Foster Sterling wrote Myths of Gender. That's also very good. So historically, to answer that question, you would get different answers depending upon at the time at which you were born, essentially. So historically, there were a lot of assumptions that because one was born male or female, they were going to behave differently. And research, again, around that time would kind of show that because there was a lot of male influence on what was going to be the outcome. And, one's gendered expectations really showed up a lot in that research. However, today, and really what we're finding more and more, is that it is incredibly difficult to make a decision about how biologically predisposed one is going to be to engage in certain behaviors, whether they are male or female, without considering the social constructions around essentially their life history, what they've been told is appropriate or not appropriate for their particular sex.
What have you heard in terms of who's going to be better at, like, male's going to be better at what, female's going to be better at X? Even if it's a stereotype, even if you know if it's wrong, what have you heard? What exists out there?
Males are better at anything that requires a lot more physical exertion, for example. Whether that's working at a construction site or sports-related things, right?
Okay.
That's one that I heard a lot growing up.
Academic tasks, mental abilities, that sort of thing.
These are hard. So I don't believe that these things hold true at all. So I just want to make that clear. But I've heard that, again, certain areas of study are more for women versus men. Our field that I'm in myself, like, there's a lot more women that are in that field than there are men. And actually the positions held at different levels of education vary a lot, where you'll have more men at PhD level and then much more women at the practitioner level.
Okay, like a master's degree and below.
Yeah, or even,
Well, again, gendered expectations. A lot of times people are, especially parents, new parents out there, are gendering whether they are meaning to or not. A lot of times just by your reactions to one child over the other, dependent upon whether they're male or female. And even just things like pushing them to continue on in sports, for example, is more likely to happen for male children, which, as a result could end up in different outcomes for males and females. And currently and historically, this has always been the case that males are physically stronger. They tend to have more muscle mass. A lot of that can be based on the social constructions around how males and females are supposed to behave. One really cool kind of analogy that Foster Sterling actually uses in her book is she calls it like the unbound foot metaphor. And she talks about how, with respect to marathon running, for example, in the late 60s, I believe, they did allow women to start running the marathon. And what was interesting is naturally the women's times were much higher than the males. And even from like the males' kind of starting points when they first started running in the 1900s, but their rate of decline for how fast they were getting was much steeper. It was much steeper than the males had been over time.
So decline meaning improvement in their running times.
Exactly. And so her whole analogy and reason for using the unbound foot was talking about when you actually are allowing women to participate in things and you're actually promoting that they are able to do things similar to males, you see differences and you see their biology responding as a function of allowing them to participate in more sports and more activity levels, essentially.
So the opportunity to actually practice the same skill reduces that sexual dimorphism which is a term I guess we haven't defined yet, that refers to the extent to which in a species the male and female genders are physiologically different from one another. And in some species, there's a very large disparity in size, color, shape, various things. And in humans, most of us, the sexual dimorphism isn't particularly apparent. I mean, it is to some extent. There are obviously some physical factors that are so much more likely to show up in women, the presence of breasts, a vagina, that sort of thing. But in overall size and shape, the differences that exist primarily on average, correct?
Yes.
So one thing I've heard, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, is that the averages within a given like sex or gender are larger than the averages across the two. So there's more, more variation in like height, weight, and size in males and in females than there is across the two in general. Like the overlap is huge.
Yes.
And you could very easily have a woman who's taller, stronger, faster, and better in every way than a counterpart that would be male who just happens to be shorter, smaller, weaker, and maybe intellectually delayed in some way. And so just having the genitalia, just because you have a penis doesn't mean you're going to be good at anything.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully that doesn't rub you the wrong way, and hopefully this won't rub you the wrong way. We're taking an ad break. Let's get back to the rubbing and talking about gender and sexuality.
Well, in Hall, Harriet Hall, who writes for the Skeptic magazine, she has a really great quote. She says, gender differences are group differences. They tell us nothing about the individual.
Okay. I guess then the overall sort of conclusion or take home from that is we can't really expect any type of anything in particular from someone just based on their sex. Is that correct?
Based on their sex, no, but you can, depending on what culture they're raised in.
Okay.
And that would be the same for if you raise a child in a religious household or a non-religious household. Those children are likely to embrace those same ideologies that they were raised with. And so if you see a heavy enforcement of gender roles where males are allowed to participate in a lot of activity, maybe pushed to continue their education, and the female's kind of expected to just be a mother or be at home, you're likely to see those individuals behaving that way because of those expectations.
Would you make the case then that how their parents respond to them when they're young has a major influence on how they turn out, like gender-wise, as they grow older?
Absolutely.
Because I know that there are certain parents who have made the claim, I treated my children completely the same. Mm-hmm. I didn't limit them or talk to them any differently than one another, even though I had a boy and a girl. Mm-hmm. And so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, and again, a lot of authors have kind of made this point too. It comes down to you're always going to be exposed to social roles. So even if you were able to control for the parenting being exactly the same, which it never really is, and some people do very well about keeping kind of very consistent rules around what, children can and can't do, they're still going to be part of a culture where they're expected to behave differently. They're going to have friends growing up who also will reinforce essentially gender norms. The kids very early on, data show, they play with same-gendered groups, or same-sex groups, I should say, and they tend to do that kind of all throughout school. So they're exposed to a lot of those expectations in some way, even if it's not via parents.
And even before we started recording, you had mentioned about how when an infant were to fall over, how people treat them differently. And I know I heard about a study where they had a baby and they handed it off to different people, and they either pretended it was a boy or pretended it was a girl, and then people reacted differently to it.
Oh yeah, there's been quite a few studies around that. So quite a few researchers have actually done studies around this, but C.V. Katzenbach, kind of following up from some talk from Lois Gould, who talked about gender-neutral parenting, kind of a fictional story. They tried to see how people would behave differently if they were told that the infant was either male or female, or not told of the gender of the baby. And essentially, they behaved differently with that child. They were asked to interact with it and were given the option of choosing some different toys that they could use with the baby. And a lot of times with the male baby, they were more likely to choose the football-shaped toy, even though it was a very tiny child. And with the female, kind of chose more dolls and different things like that.
Okay. And what about I asked this and then I asked another question. So I said you have to answer one where like a kid like falls down and then the parents respond to it differently depending on whether it's male or female.
I don't know of a particular study around that.
Oh, okay.
I do know one that's very interesting. They essentially did observation of parents and their children in museums. And they found that the parents were more likely to explain a lot of the scientific processes and different things that were going on in the museum to their male children than their female children.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you, just go through a few things where one might believe, or there might even be some data to suggest that males or females, that they are different on certain tasks. And one I know I've heard a lot about is like visual spatial sort of recognition tasks. Is there some research around who should be better at that and why?
Yeah, so a lot of the research on gender and education, I mean, that could be a really long discussion. So some of the historical assumptions are that males are better at math, females are better at reading, writing, and then males also being better at visual spatial learning, which is similar to, again, math. The data does suggest that and has suggested it for a while, but what you see is over time that gap is lessening. And you see that as more females are admitted into higher level math classes, a lot of those gender expectations are kind of changing and policies are supporting different variety groups in classrooms. You see that gap just decreasing over time. So while data has historically supported that, it again kind of goes back to if you're not allowed to learn it, you're going to expect that you're going to be bad at it.
Given the opportunity to participate, everyone ends up washing out and being pretty much the same.
Exactly. And Fine in her book actually uses a really good example. Historically, around the 17th century, there was a lot of discussion around whether women could be allowed in politics. And one excuse they kind of used for not having women in politics is that they didn't know about politics. But then that went back to they weren't allowed to participate in it. So you know nothing about something because you haven't been allowed to participate. Yeah, you're going to know nothing about it when you come into the situation. So.
Well, and then let's go about the other direction in that, or one of the things you mentioned previously is that men are not as good naturally at being nurturing and being caregivers, and that women are naturally better at that. Is there some truth to that?
Well, there's a lot of research around hormones and kind of like surge of hormones being linked to mothers being very motherly when their baby comes out, and even before that when they kind of prepare for baby. And that's not to say those hormones don't play a big role. They really do. But what's interesting, for example, Rosenblatt in 1967 did a study where they had some newborn rat pups and they removed the mother and they put the father in that situation. Now, the father rat literally never participates in the parenting. And it also doesn't experience kind of this hormonal surge of maternal estrogen and all that kind of stuff. And the father in that situation, again, because these pups needed a parent, it started taking on all the roles that the mother usually did, which include a lot of licking. That's something that rats do a lot of when they're with their baby pups, and just trying to take care of them as much as possible.
Wow, why do you think that is?
Again, it's just life circumstances. You will behave differently. And the same can be said of just new fathers. You don't have to have birthed something to love it and to feel kind of that bond with it and to be able to take on those roles of nurturing.
So I guess what is there to know? Like what would you like people to know about gender and gender studies and stuff that probably most people don't really know about?
Well, there's a lot to that question. I think one of the biggest points that a lot of gender researchers really point out is before we jump to saying that something is a masculine or feminine behavior, or assuming that people are going to be better at or worse than the other based on whatever the task is to look at the social environment, is really to look at, what's their history. Are they not able to do this because I haven't really taught them, or I haven't spent a lot of time getting them familiar with this particular subject? Different things like that.
Okay. So I'd like to talk a little bit about sexuality, and mostly just in the sense of most people identify that there's homosexuality and heterosexuality, and that's kind of it. But as I understand it, there's a little bit more to it than that, and it's maybe as complex or more complex than the range in genders that can exist.
So with respect to the nurturing, I'd like to also talk about how women can also be non-nurturing.
Okay.
So a good example, Mare wrote a book on the Amazonian women. And again, in this culture, the expectations were that everyone hunted. And so what you saw was women got very, developed some kind of masculine features. They were very muscular. They looked very similar to the males in their culture. And what was interesting is they actually often didn't raise their babies when they had them. They would actually sometimes, because they hunted with a bow a lot, bow and arrow, they sometimes would remove the breast on the side where they were shooting from to facilitate hunting. And so again, it really just goes back to, it's not necessarily biological that you're going to be maternal or not maternal, but it really speaks to like what the culture is saying is important and individual factors.
I suppose it certainly could be the case that you have a mother who is terrible at being a mother, while the father of the child is actually really good at being a parent.
Yeah. I don't think we'd have CPS if all parents were just naturally good at being a parent.
Yeah, that's a good point. Are gender studies related in any way to feminism, or is that completely different, or what do you think?
Well, feminism is just, it's really a movement to promote women's rights.
Okay.
And so, especially in the 60s is when kind of feminism really picked up and when a lot of movement happened. And they're definitely related in that both will talk about how historically it's usually women have been oppressed. Feminism also, what's nice too, is they promote a lot of, it's not just females in the workplace. They do a lot of things with LGBT community. It's essentially like minorities or people who historically have been disenfranchised in one way or the other.
Okay, so let's move on to talking about some of the differences in sexuality. And so you mentioned some of the differences in sex in terms of the chromosomal differences that can exist and even some of the physical differences that can exist. So let's actually talk about like what is sort of the range in gender that can exist and how that might be different again, across different cultures, and then the range of sexuality and how that can be different even within a culture.
So yeah, again, it's going to depend on what culture you're a part of. In our culture, most people have probably heard of like LGBT community. Anymore, the kind of more technical term is LGBTQIA plus community.
It's a lot of initials.
It is. So just to go in order, so it's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual. And then the plus kind of indicating, and there are lots of others.
Yeah.
And really, this community is trying to point out that there are many different sexualities, and people can identify as, either of those.
And within that, I know that there's even some variation in terms of you might have someone who identifies as heterosexual, but even that doesn't mean the same thing for every person who identifies as heterosexual. If we have two males who identify as heterosexual, one might have like a particular fetish, or one might be that they're heterosexual, but they don't particularly actually enjoy having sex, and so they maybe choose a celibacy. What are some other variations that might exist, or like what kind of range could you even look at that would be differentiation?
So a lot of times researchers have, and they've done a good job, but it just points out how complicated it is. They talk about sexuality as a spectrum. And so ranging, just really pointing out that every person's going to be very different and is going to identify differently than another person. And really what's interesting too is I've come into contact with students who will ask things, usually about individuals who identify as transgender. They'll say, what do I call this person? And I will kind of ask them, okay, so let's take an example here. You meet a person named Robert, and sometimes with your history, you know that people named Robert go by either Rob, Bob, Robert, maybe they go by their middle name. There's kind of a variety there. And under those circumstances, you essentially just ask them what they want to be called. And so I will tell them a lot of times that it's just ask what they want to be called and call them that. And still, a lot of times people will still say, well, but what do I say? Do I say he or she? And it's like, you need to ask that person. Mm-hmm. And it's going to depend entirely on that person. Some people will identify as transsexual or transgendered, and, either they'll want to be called of the gender they're portraying or not. It completely depends on the person, and probably the most compassionate response is just to ask that person what they want to be called and how they like to be addressed. Some groups that meet will they'll introduce themselves, kind of like if you're doing a round robin of saying, my name is Jennifer. They'll also then interject the correct gendered pronouns that they would use. So I'd say, my name is Jennifer, she, her, for example. And so whenever you refer to that person, that's the gender pronouns they want you to use.
Okay.
Hopefully the ads that are coming up are gender neutral and you get what you need out of them. We'll be back after this. And we're back.
And just because you mentioned this a few times, it's the correct use is transgender and not transgendered, correct?
Yeah. So in general, it implies, just as I don't say I'm maled or I'm femaled, it doesn't imply that it's just something that happened. It implies like an ongoing status.
Okay.
This is who I am. This is how I identify. And some people who technically might be transgender, maybe they were born biologically a male and later decided to have surgery to become a female, they might not identify as transgender. They might identify as a female because that's what they are now. And again, it all just depends entirely on the person. And some people always identify as transgender even if they don't go through the study because they've always felt they were
go through the surgery.
Don't go through the full surgery. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's all about just being aware of what people want to be called and being nice about it, essentially.
I woke up this morning and I was mailed. That's just a funny way of thinking about it. My gender just happened to me. It's like hit in the face, boom, femaled. Happened. And another one with respect to the whole sexuality thing is it the case that males are just more sexually engaged, more sexually active? Like there's the whole stereotype of, well, and I think you can see this in going to bars that women get in free because men are just walking erections looking for a female. So what is there in this, and the difference between males and females in terms of their overall sexuality and their expression of that, and who's more likely to seek out intimacy or relations? Is there any truth to the difference there?
There might be, and that's the thing with gender stereotypes. They might hold up almost 100% of the time, but it doesn't explain how each individual identifies. Another thing, a big thing with talking about sex research is that's all based entirely on self-report data. And again, going back to this history of it being okay for males to seek that out and it being less okay. I would say today it's a little bit different, but historically women weren't allowed to be interested in sex and they weren't allowed to really talk about being interested in sex. And so what you see is it's okay for a male to report that they think about sex a lot. But for a woman, when you're asked about sex and you know that that's not okay to talk about, you're less likely to report it, even if maybe you do actually think about it maybe as much as a male does. So again, depends entirely on those social constructions around sexuality and how one's allowed to express it and talk about it.
Some other things I was thinking about are what kind of, I want to say mental diagnoses like depression and suicide and things like that, how that also shows up differently across the genders.
Yeah, so one study that I really like to quote a lot is Salon-Kagaz and colleagues. So they looked at these two depression inventories, which are used frequently to determine if someone is clinically depressed. And what they found is so for the DEPS, out of the 10 questions, there was one that was pretty gendered. And then for the BDI, which has 21 questions, 3 of the items were gendered. And essentially those questions were around being able to cry, which historically women will more likely report and men will less likely report interest in sex. And so generally that doesn't really change as much for males when they report it as it does for females if they are depressed. And then willingness to express or feel sad. So what they found is really that these measures and data do show that more women are diagnosed with clinical depression than males.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be kind of entirely a function of the tests that we're using.
Oh,
because
interesting.
Some of those things are just they're going to produce more yes answers for females than they are for males. And so what you see, sadly, is there probably are males out there that could technically qualify for clinical depression that maybe aren't getting the right treatment, and females who maybe aren't quite at that level that are being treated that may benefit from lesser intense interventions, if that makes sense.
So what they found then was that the assessment tool itself had a gender bias built into it.
Yeah, and there's kind of a lot of that around that makes it really difficult to make clinical decisions.
So it's, imagine one of the questions, do you have a vagina? Because you might be depressed if you do. So what about you, Ryan? Do you cry?
Yes.
I phrased that incorrectly. Do you feel like you hold back your tears a lot? Especially because you are male? Or do you not identify as male?
I do identify as male. Do I hold back my tears because I'm male?
Yeah.
I mean, I've been
Be honest.
taught to do that, I think, by some people, not really my parents at all. And I actually cried much more than other males growing up. So I was kind of pegged with that a lot. I've since learned, it's hard to talk about now because I've since learned a lot of different stress management, coping strategies, things like that, in my life, to where it's a lot easier to not hit those points, whereas it was a lot harder, difference in the past.
Right.
So hard to track and keep straight now.
Yeah, no, I think I would have originally said no, except when I really was honest with myself about it. I definitely deliberately hold back a lot of the times, and it is because I am in the moment afraid that I'm going to be made fun of. Even if no one's around, it's like gotta hold it in, hold it together. Think about the news, or maybe not the news because that's horribly depressing anymore. Think about trees. Trees are good. I'm wondering if that's different for you and your experience than Lauren personally. Like, do you feel like you hold back your tears at all, or that you cry more than your male counterparts, or anything like that?
I would say I probably have to think about it less because it's been something that I'm kind of more allowed to do. So even tearing up at happy things or, movies or different things like that, there are rarely times where I feel like I have to hide it from the people in the room that I'm crying. I usually just let it come out. But again, I don't, that could be, I'm sure that's a function of my history, but also I've never had to think about specifically suppressing it. Maybe there were a few times where, I was in a situation where a lot of people were looking and I didn't want to appear weak, I guess, but I haven't encountered those situations very often.
Something, and we don't have to go into this if it's too far into the feminism territory, but there was the argument that women just make different career choices in life, and that they don't make as much money because they stop to go have babies, or that the pay gap that exists really is only because women choose careers that don't pay as much. So can you speak to some of that?
Yeah, that's kind of a difficult territory, only because when women do leave to have babies, that just naturally produces a gap where they're not getting promoted. Whereas if another person stayed at that company in that job for so long, they would just, be making more and potentially get promoted over that period of time. So there is kind of some truth to the fact that women will make less if they're not present in the workplace. But there still is a gap, even if you kind of take out some of those factors. And especially when you get to high-level positions. So I was just saying during break that the Fortune 500 companies, I can't remember current data, but I believe it's 1% to 5% are run by female CEOs. So most of them are males. Most MDs, again, I believe are males. So you still kind of see some of those differences. And there are careers, I think Ryan kind of mentioned this a little bit, there's careers where you see more males than females. And you do really see that, glass ceiling effect where the analogy is that there's a glass ceiling, women can't break through it, but they can see what the top looks like, and it's better than where they are.
we talked a little bit about the sexual dimorphism in terms of physicality, size, shape, physical strength. Men tend to have more upper body strength, and to an extent, there's also that women tend to have smaller brains. And you probably know a lot about this as well, that brain size correlates to body size. And we've talked about brains on this show a few times. And one thing that I don't know if we've actually mentioned before is brain size does not correlate to intelligence. So there's that aspect of it, but it's a lot more complicated than just size when it comes to like gender studies. So could you speak to some of the research, especially the more recent research on neurology and how that shows us if males and females are different in their brains and the sizes and how they work and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, so historically, you guys probably already dispelled this, but historically, things such as women's brains being smaller, they called it the missing 5 ounces of the female brain, and used that as an example of why women weren't as smart. Again, this was in a time where they didn't teach women many things that the males knew, so it essentially just confirmed their theory. Things like the corpus callosum being larger in males, they've used that to try to explain why males are smarter than females. There was this one funny one where it was called the delicacy of the female brain fibers. They thought that if they pushed them too much to learn things, that those fibers would break.
That's really funny.
That is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was the term hysteria refers to is actually means the wandering womb in Greek. You think of a hysterectomy as the removal of the uterus, or I guess the wandering uterus. And that when someone is being hysterical, it is always a woman, and it is because her uterus is wandering aimlessly around her body, and so she is freaking out. She's throwing a fit. She's hysterical because her uterus is on a walkabout. So.
And that goes right along with data on PMS and menstrual issues. That's also been an excuse for a long time as to why women can't participate in things, is they might make bad decisions when they are on their period.
All right, so what else goes on with brain and gender?
So anymore, people are more seeing that your brain essentially is a function of your history and your history with things. And so Joel and colleagues, actually more recently, 2015, I believe, looked at brain scans in relation to kind of gendered stereotypes. And they found what they called the human brain mosaic, essentially referring to that what they saw was kind of patterns of masculine and feminine features in these brains, kind of how they responded to different questions that were either masculine or feminine. There were rarely situations where the brain kind of reflected totally a male, like responses to male things and totally responses to feminine things. And now one thing that wasn't done, they didn't look a lot at fMRIs, and those are kind of more of a better look at moment-to-moment changes rather than just MRIs. Yeah. So that was kind of one critique of that study. But anymore, there are still a lot of people that research brains and talk about how they're very gendered. Simon Baron-Cohen, for example, has talked about the sympathetic E brain as being kind of feminine and the S brain being more mathematically oriented and related to males. And interestingly, his data show that less than 50% of the women had the E brain that he studied, and 17% of the males had an E brain. So anymore, you see, and I think, again, this is entirely a product of, what's culturally acceptable, the fact that people have different histories, is you really see that everyone's just different, and they're going to embrace different things at different points in time, depending on their history. And depending on, if they're in a culture where it establishes that it's okay to engage in masculine and feminine activities to, independent of one's biological sex.
So there's some more in the history of gender with respect to Hogwarts, specifically witchcraft and wizardry. So can you speak a little bit about the issues in gender with respect to like this idea of witchcraft and witches and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so Bever did a really excellent kind of article looking kind of at the data around witchcraft and actually dispelling. So, for instance, I'll just ask you guys, so what are some things you think of when I say, what is a witch or who is a witch? What are some features of a person that might be a witch?
Tempted to think of Maggie Smith, but going to the Halloween store stereotype of a witch, I'm imagining warts and green skin, similar to the Wizard of Oz depiction, hunched old haggard woman with a pointy hat and a black cat who rides a broom, like Hocus Pocus.
So in general, they were thought of like old. You mentioned that. Usually they were also thought of to be very poor and kind of outside of their community and not really participating in things. But really what they found, data on witchcraft, and interestingly, this didn't happen as frequently, but there were communities where more males were accused of witchcraft. It's purely a function of wherever you were at the geographical location and what was happening at that time. But what they found is the people that were more likely to be accused of witchcraft were females, but it was totally around economic situations. So these women tended to be married, and they were integral parts of their community, which I think really resulted in why those conflicts were happening, is someone, so to speak, pissed me off. And now if I accuse them of witchcraft, that's a really big thing that can result in that threat being gone. And again, they weren't necessarily poor. They were generally middle class. So when you look at their actual data of what these people actually were, our conceptions of what witches were is very different. And it's totally dependent upon just what was going on at that specific point in time. I think really what came of this too is one reason why perhaps females were more likely to be accused of witchcraft was there weren't a lot of appropriate outlets to engage in revenge or to get back at somebody around, for example, so women aren't really allowed to be physically aggressive, whereas males, if they had a beef with somebody, for example, they might just, fist fight or have a duel or different things like that.
Ryan and I duel a lot.
Yes. Well, and historically, that's never been appropriate for women. And so a lot of times what you see is women engaging into kind of more of that verbal conflict. And witchcraft was a really, really effective way of getting rid of your threat.
You mean accusing someone of witchcraft?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. So I guess I just want to make sure that I'm summarizing this appropriately in some of the things that we've discussed around issues of gender and, I guess feminism and equalities is wrapped up inside of this, and some of the issues that arise around what it means to be a part of a gender identity and how that can affect your behavior and how people react to you is, well, first of all, to make the distinction that sex refers to only the biological characteristics and gender refers to how one identifies with respect to the cultural expectations that are associated with that sex. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Okay, so you have those masculine behaviors, and that those are really what shows up for people in terms of identifying as either male or female or masculine or feminine is influenced by what are the circumstances of their culture and their upbringing and how people react and respond to them, what are the expectations are for them. And it just depends. And it could be anything. So if in one culture something is depicted as being masculine and another culture that might be depicted as being, or that might be viewed as feminine and vice versa. So what is a particular gender is not a black and white thing. It just depends on the culture and the times of that culture, because even across the culture, it can shift. And so gender is this kind of nebulous idea and is not binary necessarily, but it has sort of a spectrum of just what is relevant for a given culture, and that those circumstances for those individuals are going to be the conditions under which they're going to behave in a particular way, because as you mentioned, the people that are around them are either going to treat them, I guess, negatively if they behave outside of what those gendered expectations are, or treat them positively if they're behaving inside of what those gendered expectations are. Or there might be some other type of reaction that they have where it's just sort of, we don't know how to react to this, so we're just going to ignore them sort of thing. So does that sort of summarize how we've just talked about the role of how the culture is involved in gender?
Yes.
All right. What do you got, Ryan?
I like it. It was nice and succinct. I guess the only thing I had to still contribute was just like if people are looking for this to be like a resource to help on these sort of things, like that's not really what we're functioning as.
Mm-hmm.
And there's resources out there if you're looking for them. I usually refer people to start by looking at the American Psychological Association website. So it's apa.org.
Okay. And we can also link to the books and articles that you referenced in here in the show notes, so anybody can access those and read through those. I've read parts of those books, never all the way cover to cover, but they get some really cool stuff in there. I liked the Cordelia Fine Delusions of Gender was really good.
It's a very easy read too.
Yeah.
If you had one to suggest as like a starting place to jump off, what would it be?
The Delusions of Gender. It's a really easy read. There's not a lot of complicated language.
Okay. Yeah, and I sat backseat on a lot of this just because I actually don't know really much at all on this topic, so I'm going to jump into that one myself.
Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, so one thing I wanted to end on then is what in your opinion is important about studying gender? Like, why is it necessary to have this discussion? Why should people be aware of this? What is there to know about this, I guess?
I think it's important too. I know I kind of talked about a lot of the social constructions around why men and women, end up being different. And it's not to say that biology doesn't play a part. It of course does. If you're looking for a really good discussion around the nature and nurture, the importance of both of those and how they're always intertwined, I would look at Susan Schneider's Science of Consequences book. It's a really good discussion of all that. But in pointing out that those are a function. So, for example, males are stronger. Data indicate that.
On average.
On average, yeah. Well, in general, yes. And that could perhaps always be the case. Even if we change some of our social kind of constructions around allowing females to participate equally in some of these different sports and things that males are allowed to do.
Do you think it could be the case that if we were to culturally begin to select what we believe as being attractive is like masculine characteristics in women, so women who are taller, bigger built, and more muscular, that we might actually start to sort of in a way selectively breed women who are more biologically more likely to be taller, stronger, and have more masculine features? Is that a possibility, do you think?
That's always a possibility.
Okay.
And I'm not saying, we should or shouldn't do one or either or both or any of those. It's really just pointing out that whenever you're making a discussion or talking specifically about what's a masculine thing to do, what's a feminine thing to do, and who's going to be better, you really have to consider all of the different things that are going to influence how a person is able to behave given certain circumstances, what they're able to do, etc. And so, as I was saying, even if it could be true that males will always be stronger, they'll always be faster. But really what we're seeing is that if you allow people to equally participate in things, you might see some pretty incredible differences. So it's just important to point out that it's not just biology. It really is a lot of those social constructions around how people are allowed to behave that influence our biological makeup and our structure and whether I have more muscle mass than Ryan, for example.
Cool. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today and share your expertise in this area. I definitely learned a lot. Do you have anything else you want to close out with?
There are a ton of resources around, if you feel like you're a member or might be a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, there are so many resources out there that are really amazing. And so if you were listening to this kind of for that reason, I would just really seek out a lot of those different resources in your community.
Okay. Anybody who's interested in asking questions, send them to info@www.podcast.com, and we can always forward those on to Lauren, and she can respond to those, or we'll field them first, so anything crazy we'll filter out. But reasonable questions, if that's okay, we can pass those on, and you can potentially answer some questions, maybe even just provide some links to resources or whatever. So. Mm-hmm.
This seems like a good time to take a break. We'll be right back. And we're back. Okay, so that wraps it up for that discussion. Again, really cool, interesting. I really enjoyed it. And, we did get some sort of pushback from a few listeners about us, not necessarily considering all the angles in here. And it sounded like there was some orientation there to feeling like one is made to feel bad because of their gender and sexuality, specifically those who are in a position of privilege. So let's first reiterate a few points and then talk about some new information here.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, to reiterate what was talked about in the episode, gender, sex, and orientation are three very different things. Sex being the biological attributes with specific expressions or like physiological expressions. It's still not binary. So you've got male, female, intersex, et cetera, et cetera. But this is our biological kind of expressions.
Right, of sex, yeah. And there's even more to unpack there.
Yes.
Then, yeah, gender therefore refers to the social construct based on how a person identifies and referring to the spectrum of what is considered maleness, femaleness, or something else, non-binary or other. And there is kind of an unlimited number of possible genders that might exist because they're going to be unique to times and cultures and history and places around the world.
Absolutely. And then orientation is going to refer to who one might be attracted to, if they're attracted at all. And that's going to include gay, lesbian, straight, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really important because a lot of the discussions around sexuality and gender tend to mix these up a little bit. So sex is a biological expression. Gender is the social construct that the person identifies with. And orientation typically refers to who the person is attracted to or the group of people the person is attracted to.
And finally, one of the best ways that you can really support the trans community is ensuring that we're using the preferred pronouns, treating them as human beings who are who they are, and accepting that they are who they said that they are. And that really considering them misgendering them intentionally or otherwise, but usually it's intentional. I think we're forgiving of accidental misgendering most of the time. But particularly when you're being a jerk about it, it really stigmatizes the person and can impact their self-worth and overall sense of well-being.
Also, too, dead naming somebody who identifies as trans actually can bring up previous traumas that the person has experienced, and they are no longer that person. So it's just a really super awful thing to do. If you're not familiar with what dead naming is, essentially just means that once somebody transitions, they may have a new name and you're still calling them by their old name. So if my name is Shane and I transition to being Shayna and you still call me Shane, then that will be an example of dead naming.
Yep. That has resulted in a lot of problematic things, including suicide for people in that community. So by the parents who refused, they were dead naming their child, and the person subsequently attempted suicide. So yes, I guess if you're pro dead children, then dead naming is probably something you like to do. But if you're not, then maybe treat people with compassion and respect.
Yep, absolutely.
And then, of course, the final point to hit on from just recapping from the episode is that there is an increased rate of depression, anxiety, and risk of suicide associated with constant misgendering, as I mentioned. And again, it doesn't have to be from necessarily parents, but anybody who's being disrespectful to that community.
You can read some articles on that from Macklemore 2015 and 2018. So those are very recent studies that show how impactful misgendering can be with that.
Yeah, at least one of those definitely would have come out after the episode that we recorded. So yeah, good to know that those resources are out there.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and dive into some new information, some stuff that I think is really fun to kind of dive into. And it's not necessarily, I don't want to say it's new information or it wasn't included in the episode, but it's just some new stuff to talk about. So as of 2020, there is a second edition of the National Sexuality Education Standards. And this outlines several areas of sex education that include sexuality and gender as topics of discussion. Unless you're in Florida, then it's 0 topics.
Fact. Yeah. They're doing the anti-education thing.
Yeah, they don't like book learning here. That's the thing that I've learned. So this actually includes those 7 topics, and we're going to go over what each of them is. And I think it's important to talk about what it covers because it does kind of give you an idea of how the breadth of something like a sex education program. So the first is consent and healthy relationships. That talks about what yes and no means. It talks about assent within that, and it talks about healthy relationships and safe relationships specifically.
The next one is anatomy and physiology, or AP, which in this case does not stand for advanced placement. This refers to essentially just a discussion of the general parts of sexuality, what the components are, what are related to.
Just like literally body. It's all body related.
Yeah, it's your body. I mean, then that's what we were describing is that sex is the biological attributes, and it also is on a spectrum, and there's a variety of presentations of that.
Yes, exactly. So then there's also puberty and adolescent sexual development, or PD, and that really is going to encompass all the physiological and anatomical changes that go along with puberty, and specifically all the development that goes along within that.
Gender and identity expression. This is also important because this is a thing that's shifted over time where different gender expressions were viewed as being pathological in the past, and it is now understood that they are not only not pathological, but treating them as pathological creates mental health problems. And so that, I think, has been something that's been more recently updated, and that this just covers what the different gender expressions and identities are.
Yeah, and gender affirming practices as well. And then there's also sexual orientation and identity. So that goes into kind of discussing attraction and what that means and kind of navigating some of that information with the person.
Of course, an important part of sexual health. This just cannot be emphasized enough, because we are creatures who engage in sexual things. Otherwise, our species would stop existing.
Yes.
And doing so comes with certain risks. And there's lots of ways that all creatures engage in sexual behaviors. And so doing so as safely as possible is critical to a safe, a healthy, thriving society. And treating it as if it is all taboo and inappropriate is absurd, to the point of creating a lot of harm. So anyway, it's useful to have a healthy discussion about sexual health.
Yes, absolutely. And then finally, there's also interpersonal violence. And basically what that's teaching is how to stay safe in domestic abuse situations, how to maintain safety when you're in sexually compromised situations as well. So it talks a lot about that and kind of the interpersonal parts of that. It piggybacks on the consent and healthy relationships piece, but it is more specific to domestic violence stuff.
Cool. This next part gets a little bit into kind of like news and politics, if you will, but that's relevant because this all of a sudden in the last year or so, gender identity and gender politics have been thrown both into the spotlight and then completely shredded to cabbage by the United States, at least current authority figures and those that be. So we basically decided that women in this country don't matter. So welcome to the United States, unless you're a woman.
Yeah. It's really unfortunate.
Or not white, I guess.
Or not white. Yeah. Just if you're not like a straight white dude, then good luck. So at the time of this update, 93% of people in the U.S. actually support sex education being taught in middle school, while 96% support education in high school. So there's a lot of people that agree that sex education should be taught in either middle school or high school. The majority of people really do. And those topics would include things like STIs, puberty, healthy relationships, birth control, sexual orientation, and all of these things are included in the National Sex Education Standards.
Now, despite the support for this, there are many programs that teach abstinence-only programs, which have been shown to be ineffective. They limit education on various aspects of sexuality and gender, and essentially forbid teachers from talking about it at all, which again is just anti-education. It's like making you less intelligent as an outcome of going to your institution of insanity. So, for example, Florida's recent, quote, "Don't Say Gay," unquote, bill that effectively passed that bans any lessons or discussion around sexual orientation or gender identity, despite the fact that gender identity, consent, and healthy relationships, etc., are both ubiquitous and extremely important topics and relevant to kids who are, starting to experience an understanding of their sexuality.
Right.
We didn't talk about this really before, so I'm sort of ad-libbing here, but I think it is an important fact here is that there are children who are sexually abused and that they then are introduced to this world very early. And if they are not given some kind of education about that, that can be very confusing until, they get older and they're not really sure how to respond or react, or sometimes don't even understand that they were victims for a long time. And so I think having this education relatively early on to help people understand like what could be happening out there is useful. And maybe I think it's going to make sense at various levels based on where people are at, but just something to consider.
A lot of the misinterpretation is that people think that sex education is a full-on sex ed program at kindergarten, and that's just not what it is. It's basic anatomy, it's safety, it's consent and assent, it's healthy relationships. That's a lot of what that education would encompass. But for some reason, everybody thinks that I'm going to go in and hand a bunch of condoms to kindergartners and go, good luck. And that's just not what it is. That's just not what any sex education program, a comprehensive sex education program includes those 7 things. Because like you said, there are kids that are sexually abused, but there's also kids that grow up in families that are incredibly welcoming and open and they have gay parents, and they can't talk about their parents in a kindergarten class because it goes against these types of bills. So that's why this is incredibly harmful. It's not that people are trying to groom kids. It's that they're trying to give them relevant, age appropriate information to keep them safe going forward. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no evidence that that is function as grooming in any situation either.
There's more evidence in the Catholic Church. I'm just saying.
Yeah. And actually, I think you could specifically point to keeping them ignorant is actually a way of grooming.
Yeah.
You're keeping them naive to the situations that they might be facing. So I would argue that if you are pushing anti-education practices that do not talk about this, that you are actually setting up children to be more likely to be victims of sexual assault.
100%. And there's studies that show that in the developmental disabilities realm quite a bit too, unfortunately.
Right.
I want to say it's something between 40 and 80% of learners with disabilities are likely to be abused in that regard.
That is a horrifying number. That is really gross.
Yeah, it's really gross because there's no education programs that exist, at least comprehensive ones, and people say, oh, we're not going to teach it. So,
right.
But as a glaring example of the need for education in this area is the discussion around abortion and understanding what abortion actually is. I'm going to go ahead and just refer to the abortion episode so you all can do that. A lot of people really misunderstand what it is. And many Americans actually lack a fundamental understanding of what sexuality means across the entire spectrum. And if you're not convinced, here are some quotes from real adults.
So the first one is, quote, "On Saturday, my boyfriend and I slept together, but since we had no protection, I asked him to keep his boxers on, and ejaculation did not occur. I'm currently on my menstrual cycle. Is there any chance that I might get pregnant? Should I take emergency contraceptives?" End quote.
It gets better.
Okay.
Here's another quote. Quote, "You know a woman needs to have an orgasm in order to have babies, right?" My favorite thing is the response to that was like, "Honey, let me tell you, if that were true..."
1/10 the current population.
Yes.
All right. The next quote: "Homosexual females can't physiologically have sex with each other, though." End quote.
Yeah, and my favorite one is, quote, "If you get horny, milk comes." End quote. And that's in reference to lactation.
Just so we're clear, all of these statements are 100% wrong. The wrongest wrong.
So they could not be more wrong, but it is important to note that this is the kind of stuff that people believe. People do believe this. Like I've had to explain to grown adults what a fallopian tube was and how a period works. So so the fact that this is just something that just is so glaringly gone from United States education that it's becoming a more serious problem.
Now, another thing that I want to address real quick and just talking about this, because there's sort of two things to bring up in reference to this episode and the feedback, as well as something currently in the news. One is there was recently a discussion. There's the Senate confirmation hearings of Ketanji Brown Jackson into the Supreme Court, where they got all up in arms about asking her to define what a woman is, not necessarily offering one themselves. Although one very foolish congressperson or senator, who I'm not going to name because they don't deserve any more attention, got up and said, "A woman is someone with XX chromosomes and no thingy between their legs," I believe is the way that it was phrased.
Wow.
Incredible levels of stupidity there. But one thing to unpack in that is, you might ask, well, why is that stupid? Why is that wrong? Well, first of all, you can actually have XX chromosomes and have a thingy between your legs just as a biological variation. That happens to some people. You can have XY chromosomes and not have a thingy between your legs. So there's that. You can have several chromosomal variations that are neither XX or XY, and either not or have a thingy between your legs, and that will look different. The thingy that's there may not function. So whether or not it's present doesn't seem like that's always the most relevant factor.
Yeah.
For example, they can be formed in a particular way that makes it difficult to function sexually, or makes it difficult to reproduce, or makes it difficult to do whatever. Like there's various complications that arise during development that many people experience, and it certainly should not be shamed for that, and certainly not told that they don't have a sexual or gender identity because they were born differently. Right. Is absolutely absurd. And I think there's many other problems with that argument. But primarily, this was an anti-trans, and therefore, by proxy, or I guess reciprocally, what that means is this was a transphobic tirade by someone who is extremely poorly educated and very uninformed.
Yep, absolutely, 100%. So I appreciate that side note. That was great.
Thanks.
One thing I like to do too is I like to dispel some myths. And so this is where some of the behavioral notes are going to come in. And so the thing is that when people talk about sex and sexuality, a lot of times folks assume that sexualized behavior in general is about the orgasm, about getting off, about feeling good. But that's not always the case. So an example of an assessment that was done in 2004, Fife et al. Had actually found that a 9-year-old boy's inappropriate sexual behavior, they were groping nurses and like direct care staff. It was actually reinforced by attention from others and had no sexual gratification component. And there's other studies that show like, public masturbation is not about getting off, but it's about getting out of the classroom and stuff like that. So there's a lot of examples of how people misinterpret sexualized behavior as being about an orgasm or about feeling good. good. And there's actually plenty of other examples of where that's just not the case.
In 1999, Milton Berger and colleagues focused on safety, specifically with respect to preventing sexual abuse among learners and individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities successfully with their intervention. And this tackled the interpersonal violence aspects of sex education standards to help prevent those people from being further victimized.
Yeah, it was actually a really successful study.
Which is fantastic. We need a lot of that going on, I think.
Yep, absolutely. And another note, too, is fetishes actually might be a result of pairing that naturally occurs when rewards are paired with cues in the environment at a very high strength. So it's not always about an orgasm because not every fetish is about an orgasm, right? So different types of sensations and different types of preferences get shaped up through pairing and kind of reintroducing those rewards with those cues, whatever those rewards may be. So a lot of times people think fetishes are just about getting off, and again, it's not that simple. It's actually a much more nuanced and much more complex conversation.
Real basic. I mean, you go back to associative learning is basically what we're talking about here is associating one thing with another, not necessarily intentionally. Like it's essentially when we talk about associative learning, we're talking about things that are associated for you, and then you learn that association as an outcome of them being paired together. That's why we call it pairing. Yeah. So, and then one more I'd say is like we just had a little bit of pushback on this originally around talking about the privilege of men, in particular white cisgender men. But I think without taking another whole episode to dive in that, the data are just very clear on this. So a lot of people point to the fact that the pay gap in women might be attributable to the fact that they leave the workforce to take care of children. I think one thing to consider is that if we had laws that were more equitable around parenting practices, then they wouldn't necessarily be obligated. And also, even when they control for that, you still have gaps in the wages.
Right.
It's not just wages. Like you also see that in promotional opportunities. You see it where attention has been given to people who even make it into different fields. That like even when people of color and women make it into STEM fields, they don't get cited for the work that they do. And so it sort of shows that the attention is given to people who look like the people they expect to find in those fields and is less, therefore friendly, or appears less friendly to people of those other domains, including women. And I always want to be careful that we're not ignoring a problem because it makes us uncomfortable. And it feels like that's a lot of what happens when people refuse to acknowledge the discrepancies and disparities that exist among people of color, women. And like, until we could definitively prove unequivocally and without having to like manipulate and massage the data until it shows us what we want, until we can prove that there's no more disparity, I think we should work towards equity.
Yeah.
And equity, I think, can mean in a lot of cases that we need to actively work to pull up people who have been held down by the system because that gives them the best access to a relatively level playing field. So that'd be how I'd finish that up.
Honestly, I've got no other point to make than that. I think that's it. I 100% agree with that. I mean, ultimately, you know, the conversation around privilege is always one of those things that it gets people all fired up. It doesn't mean that your life wasn't hard. It just means that it wasn't made harder by how you were born. That's exactly all it is.
Right.
So grow up, stop being a snowflake about it. Like, I mean, that's just me getting like, you know, that's just me I get really worked up about that because it's like, nobody's saying that your life wasn't hard. Like nobody is making that argument, but your life wasn't harder because of other things. Yeah,
you're exactly right. I think that's mic drop. We did it.
Yeah, there you go. Done.
All right. Well, so I think that kind of actually hits our take-home points for me, at least. I mean, do you have more take-home points to hit on there?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay, perfect. Well, gender and sexuality is a thing. Let's talk about our recommendations.
Recommendations. Recommendations. My recommendation this week is a book called Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey. So this is one of those things. I'm not somebody who's like totally enamored by celebrity. I just find certain celebrities interesting and I just want to kind of know their story because they stand out. Yeah. Matthew McConaughey being one of those people. Apparently his book, I'd always heard that it was really good. So I picked it up, and what it is he basically grabbed all of his journal writings, all of his poetry, all of his things, and brought them in boxes out into the middle of the desert and spent a year by himself writing this book and basically collecting collecting these stories, and it's like basically a storytelling, kind of like his journey. It's like an autobiography, but it's a really interesting kind of like life lessons, and talks about how he grew up and how he got these acting gigs, and basically how he's made so much opportunity for himself that he's like really tried to like just kind of say yes to things.
Okay.
But it's also like interspersed, like it's designed really well. The book is designed really well. It's interspersed with like writings of his, like handwritten letters and poetry and stuff like that. So it's a really cool read. I think that you could expect it from somebody like Matthew McConaughey.
Sure.
But I still think that it's kind of got an unexpected feel to it. It's really, really insightful.
Cool. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I appreciate the recommendation.
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. That's coming across for me.
Yeah.
I get it. I'm recommending a movie with a small caveat. So this is Lost City is the movie. This is Channing Tatum, Sandra Bullock, and Daniel Radcliffe. It did came out a while ago, but I just saw it recently because it's on one of the streaming platforms now. So caveat to this. I don't think this movie is breaking a lot of new ground. It's not telling a super original story. It's not like it's, you know what it kind of do is just like, here's a type of story that we've been told. Here's another more modern version update on this, but it's like, it's really fun. Like, it's really funny. I think the characters are charismatic. I think it's a fun story. Daniel Radcliffe really shines in his character. But yeah, Channing Tatum and Sandra Bullock bring a lot of really witty, humorous things. There's actually a short bit in here with Brad Pitt, who is very good. And so the whole movie, I think, really works as just a fun comedy, adventure, sort of romance thing thrown in there. I've enjoyed it, so I'm recommending it. If you're in for like a sort of turn my brain off and just enjoy the ride sort of movie, this is the one. Okay, good. Yeah, it's on my list. I'm going to add it. Perfect. All right, well, let's go ahead and wrap this up now. We've been at this for a while. This is already sort of, we packed an episode with more stuff. So as we go, we want to say, if you would like to reach out to us and talk to us more about this episode, you can reach us at info@wwdpodcast.com. Reach out to us on the social media platforms. If you'd like to support us, you can leave us a rating and a review, or tell a friend, buy some merch, or join us on Patreon. The people who have already joined us on Patreon includes, but is not limited to, Amanda, Brad, The Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kim, Kelly, Cassia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and Stephanie. Thank you all so much for all your wonderful contributions and generosity. You are the best. So good. Of course, I could not do this without my team. So thank you to Selena, Kyle, Alan, Jess, Patrick, and Justin. And of course, Shane, you helped put together the additional notes for this. So thank you for recording with me today and for putting together the notes. And of course, thank you to our original guest, Lauren, for recording the episode with us. She's so nice. Very much so. Is there anything that I missed, Shane, or anything we should leave before we sign off? I got nothing else. Perfect. Well, then this is Abraham. And this is Shane. We're out. See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.